What we need to look at is possibly less exciting. We need to look more closely at the availability of data, production excess, production deals, diversified revenues, a number of things that I think argue the point or explore the point about the risky nature of Hollywood. All of these areas I think need to be examined more carefully, and I want to go through this quickly with you, pointing out some of these areas and why I think this claim about risky, Hollywood being a risky business is problematic. The first has to do with the data available, and anyone who does work in the film industry knows how difficult it is to find good data, reliable data. And it's not some political economist who made this observation, but Harold Bogle, who's a very legitimate investment type person, advises people where to put their money, noted in one of his books, the lack of access to real numbers in this industry is astounding, and it's getting worse all the time. We have no way to judge Hollywood's actual return on equity, nor can we accurately assess the year-to-year health of the film business. Well, how do we know anything about whether or not a film is risky when we don't really have good data? Another point has to do with production excess. Very often, the riskiness of filmmaking is attributed to the high costs of production and marketing. High production costs are often blamed on demanding stars and other kinds of profit participants who receive multi-million-dollar contracts. Many would argue that the movie business is out of control, with inflated production budgets and outrageous marketing expenses. In fact, the most recent average for just negative costs, production costs and so forth, from the MPAA is about $63 million. This doesn't include marketing, which is another, on the average, $34 million. But if we start looking at some of the films that we're familiar with, the recent example I want to use is King Kong. And most of you may know that Universal Pictures paid Peter Jackson himself $20 million to write, produce, and direct. The film itself cost over $200 million. It wasn't the most expensive film of all time, but certainly pricey in light of what's being called a very weak box office. It might be argued very simply that film production doesn't need to be so costly. It doesn't require extravagantly paid stars. It doesn't demand huge amounts to be spent on advertising and marketing. And while some people in the industry would agree with these points, this begs the question of whether or not the prevailing film industry practices that involve these very high-priced films are inherently risky. In order to sort some of this out, we also need to look at the various kinds of production deals. To begin to understand the risk, we need to understand how distribution companies arrange with other companies to produce films. And there are various types. First of all, there are in-house films produced each year by the major studios. However, many production distribution deals are arranged with separate, supposedly independent productions by way of packs. Some of these companies become somewhat dependent on the studios in terms of these packs and actually have offices on the studio lots, receive various levels of support in addition to distribution deals. The majors also distribute films without any financial involvement at all. These agreements are called negative pickups. They're typically arranged before a film is completed. In this type of deal, the distributor may provide an advance to a producer, may also finance releasing costs, but the distributor and producer then share the profits. In other words, the producer provides the production capital, limiting the studio's risk to distribution. There are also various co-production and distribution deals that the studios actually do together. Major distributors as well as pre-sales from distribution rights to foreign distributors are common. The important point here is that the Hollywood majors don't always risk their own money. In fact, often they don't. They don't have to finance films always financing the films that they distribute. Another point, and I think also you're very well aware of this one. Again, it's claimed that the majority of Hollywood films are risky because they don't get back their costs in theaters. However, most of these claims focus only on the receipts, the revenues received during a film's theatrical release, without really taking into account the diverse number of sources for revenues. It's obvious that motion pictures sold in mini retail markets or windows of exhibition, as they're sometimes called. These include home video, cable, television, and so forth. Other products and merchandise are also related to Hollywood films that contribute additional revenues. In other words, Hollywood films continue to make money for distributors across various platforms in various ways years after their initial theatrical release. Because of the significance of these sources of revenue, I think it's of interest to look at them in a little more detail, keeping in mind that all of these are markets that operate somewhat differently. First of all, theatrical box office grosses for the last few years have kind of gone up, and then last year went down. Although box office receipts are only one source of revenue for Hollywood films, theatrical releases usually come first and set the value for other markets. Although other windows may represent higher earnings, theatrical revenue is still substantial, I would argue. It has been widely reported that Hollywood struggled last year. Lots of people were fretting, and there's been a lot of attention drawn to the decline in the box office. Overall revenue was down about 8%. Despite the problems this means for motion picture theaters, actually the reason why supposedly audiences were fleeing to other electronic entertainment may not be as problematic for the majors in that they're involved in those other markets. The distributor's share of the total box office receipts is called film rentals, and typically they can be as high as 90% of the box office after exhibitors' expenses. It's often claimed that distributors receive 50% of gross box office, but I think that's highly underestimated, hugely underestimated. In fact, I think the distributors make a good deal more than 50%. You also might note here that it says US and Canada, and I just want to emphasize that as Dallas drew attention to the relationship of Canada and the United States. Hollywood still doesn't see the border and considers domestic box office US and Canada. Right? That's the way they count it. I would argue that theatrical box office still brings in a considerable amount of money. For instance, Spider-Man, if you recall a few years ago, just on one weekend made over $114 million. In a single day made $43 million. And over 9 days, $223 million. Well, these are records, but still it is possible to hit it big at the box office. What about our more recent example of King Kong? Well, this huge budget, there's this worry, how are we possibly going to make back the money? Well, it's already made back its production costs in the domestic box office as of a week ago or so, over $216 million. This is just domestic box office, Canada and the US. There's also, as you know, home video in various kinds of video technology, and this is far more than the box office. The home video market is an extremely important source of revenue for Hollywood, but it is often, in fact, usually overlooked when assessing the risky nature of the film business. Despite last year's gloom and doom, the home video industry still hovered around $24 billion. And that is considerably more than the box office. It also might be noted that these products are especially profitable. For instance, DVDs, and King Kong will be coming out very soon in DVD, are extremely profitable. They wholesale for about $10 or $15 each, and are sold to consumers for, well, you know how much. One studio head explained that the studios make at least $15 in profit for the sale of one DVD. So not only does the sale of video cassettes and DVDs represent larger revenues than the theatrical box office, distributors benefit grandly from an especially lucrative model of revenue sharing from this market. More money. There is also television, of course. There are also various markets involved with films on television. One is pay-per-view, pay cable, offer a window after the box office. But at least for pay cable, there's a possibility to continue airing these films for years and years and years. For broadcast television, or what is, I think, erroneously called free television, there's yet another market. And for King Kong, just recently, Turner Broadcasting has made the deal to premiere the film on their channels. It's unknown how much they've paid for this, but there's more money. Then, there are foreign markets, of course. Hollywood features attract revenues from theatrical, television, home video markets, and international markets. The foreign market has grown substantially in the past years, with estimates of around 50% of Hollywood's overall revenues coming from international markets. An important note here is that the distribution of films to foreign markets requires little by way of additional costs. In fact, the notion of film's infinitely exportability, the fact that it's infinitely exportable without very much cost added, a concept that Dallas Smythe's student Tom Duback developed, translates to additional nearly pure profits in constantly expanding foreign markets. More money. How about King Kong in foreign markets? Well, it's already made back to some extent its production cost. So far, as of a week or so ago, we're at $326 million. There are other markets that we don't hear too much about, but I think we're familiar with. Non-theatrical markets. A variety of additional markets add even further revenue. The largest non-theatrical market are airlines, although films are also licensed to universities, hotels, prisons, military, more money. Not a lot compared to these other outlets, but still they represent a minor source of revenue, and they continue to bring in money, which I think is the important point. Okay, what about the internet? I think it's probably too early to include revenues from internet and certainly video on demand, as these venues are only just emerging as possible markets and sources of revenue. It seems likely that the major distribution companies will do everything in their power, as they are, to maintain their control over these new outlets. However, new problems still loom, especially related to piracy and developing some kind of business model. Nevertheless, a recent article cover story in The Economist concluded that the studios will eventually figure out how to fully capitalize on the promise of the web. And the cover story featured our film King Kong, by the way. So we've covered distribution outlets or windows. But a film also, there's more money possible, sorry. There's more possible revenue from other kinds of commodities. In fact, a film often inspires other commodities based on that film, especially in the area of video games, publishing, music, and merchandising. Not all films, and it's I think important to note this, not all films generate these additional revenues. However, some box office hits are able to profit quite handsomely from additional commodities that flow from the original film commodity. Many different kinds of deals are involved in the licensing of rights to characters, stories, music, and so forth that flow from the original film product. And to use King Kong as our example here, we have several games, but especially the video game that was developed with Peter Jackson that became very important. We also had various kinds of publications, and I couldn't even start to indicate all of them. These are a little dark, I'm sorry, but it's a big monkey. Lots of publications, just tons. There's also the music, the soundtrack, as well as other kinds of products that feature music.